Hi, it's Christina with the Sisyphean Journal. We are continuing with the Triggernometry interview with Dr. Calum Miller, where they're discussing abortion. This next section is abortion debate in the context of history and geography. So let's see what they have to say here.
Calum, you're making great points, and it's genuinely fascinating. And these are issues that I've never explored, and these are arguments that I've never really thought about. My question to you would be, isn't it somewhat redundant? We're never going to change our position on abortion. We're just not.
First of all, that isn't true. It tends to be the... James Davison Hunter looked at some... it was back in the 80s, I believe. The National Council of Catholic Bishops, National Right to Life, and I think one other organization, because there were three surveys. That surveys are often designed just so that you can get a number to say there's public support for what I believe or for what I want to do. But these surveys were funded in order to learn how Americans really thought about abortion, in order to enable these groups to more effectively put their message across. So it wasn't we want lots of numbers of people who say no abortion. This is, okay, the people who want abortion to be allowed or want abortion to be promoted. What is going on in people's minds so that we can develop our strategies. And I forget exactly how he put it, but basically the more confident the person is... Yeah, I'm going to look this up. Stay right here. Okay, I'm back. James Davison Hunter summarized the findings in... well, part of it became incorporated into a book called Before the Shooting Begins, about the culture war. But he also published specifically what Americans really think about abortion in the journal First Things in 1992. And he made note, curiously, the people most confident in their misinformation about abortion law generally, and Roe v. Wade in particular, were the ones most hostile to the pro-life cause. Those who viewed themselves as moderately or strongly pro-choice, who are also disproportionately college-educated, for example, are nearly 2 times more likely than the national average to say that Roe permits abortion only in the first 3 months. So we're seeing that not just the most misinformed people, but the people who are most confident in their bad information are more likely to support abortion. So getting people to let go of their ignorance is the key here. Most people are not bloodthirsty monsters who want babies to die and mothers to spend the rest of their lives grieving. Not even most people who work in abortion clinics are bloodthirsty monsters. In fact, even Kermit Gosnell managed to convince himself that he was doing the right thing. But generally, the more you know, the more you're like, why are we doing this? This makes no sense. So that's an important thing. I think the more information that gets out, the less favor abortion finds among people.
That's not the way society has gone. We're becoming ever more progressive. We're becoming ever more hyper-liberal.
We're becoming ever more progressive. That reminds me of a quote by Ogden Nash. There has been a lot of progress during my lifetime. Unfortunately, it has been in the wrong direction.
Abortion is just a done issue, isn't it?
It can feel like that way if you're on my end of the the debate. So yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to be defeatist, but you know, on the other hand, there are so many issues where people would have felt defeatist. I mean, every sort of infrastructural injustice throughout history has felt monumental, and I try to avoid linking it to other structural injustices throughout history, but we can all think of some. And when you go back 500 years to something that was just part of society then, people would have said this is never going to be ended. This is such an integral part of what our society is built on. And it would have felt like, how can you take that sort of foundation away from a building? It would just collapse.
That was actually part of the justification in, I think it was Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where the Supreme Court said so many people are just used to abortion being there that we can't upset the apple cart by telling them, no, you can't do this anymore. It's like, well, no, it's too much of a lifestyle change. Well,
and no one would ever tolerate that.
I mean, for example, I know you don't want to go into the examples, but I think it's a pertinent one here. Slavery not only was a common practice throughout human history, but actually it was a huge part of the economic arrangements that made those societies function. And yet here we are, more slaves than ever. But but we have eliminated at least the legal in the Western world. The legal situation. So I actually agree with you on that. You know, Francis is right that I think it's hard to see how you get from where we are to where you'd like to be, but it's also, we also know that it's possible, historically speaking.
I think that's true. I mean, I watched the film Amazing Grace the other day about William Wilberforce, the kind of foremost abolitionist in the UK, and you know the sort of rhetoric and the immense money that was in the slave trade. It was seen as absolutely formidable. It was such a basic part of society. How could you possibly get rid? It was almost like getting rid of electricity. It's what society ran on, but it was run on the back of slaves who were human beings with dignity and honor and in my view, made in the image of God. And so you have to persevere, because if this really is an injustice, people do eventually come round. And you know, I think people do come round. I meet people in my life, whether sometimes they're Christian, sometimes they're Muslim, sometimes they're not religious at all. When they look at the argument, many of them do come round and say, actually, I do think this is an injustice and this is a societal problem that we should try and remedy. And I think if you persevere, you can get to that point. One thing that I think is really, really interesting in all of this is how kind of global factors play into this. Now, what we've seen in the last few years is Russia make it official government policy to try and limit abortions. They haven't tried to ban it, but they've said we should reduce the number because our population is falling. China is pretty much coming to do the same thing. I don't read Chinese, so I don't know exactly what the media is saying, but it looks to me like they're trying to limit abortion because of the population. Now, what I'd say there is this is a helpful illustration, because it also shows why the pro-life attitude is very different to the controlling women attitude. You've had many societies in history which have abolished abortion or banned abortion because they thought the population was important and they need to control women in order to increase the population. Ancient Rome did this, Romania did this, Russia and China may be going that way. That's not the pro-life position. The pro-life position is unborn children should be protected, not because it's convenient to society, not because women can be controlled for the good of society, but because they have dignity and basic human rights. And so, in that sense, those sorts of societal shifts are in some ways encouraging, because they show that, you know, attitudes can change, and they do change, you know, for factors way beyond our control in geopolitics. But it's also something that I'd really want to separate the pro-life position from and say, although some of the sort of conclusions they're reaching are encouraging, the means and the attitude is completely wrong. This shouldn't be about population, which is a problem. This should be about protecting the most vulnerable people in society. So, yeah, I think it's swings and roundabouts.
And
okay, so we're moving into the next section, and because we're only 8 minutes in, let's just keep chugging along. This next section is abortion and religion.
Would you still think what you think if you weren't Christian?
Absolutely, and I have.
And would you still think what you think if you weren't Christian? I became a pro-lifer long before I became a Christian. Same thing happened to Bernard Nathanson. They're separate.
Really, no doubt about that. The reason I say that is because my Christian convictions were completely separate in terms of timing, in terms of kind of the basis from my convictions on abortion. So I believed in some of the basic truths of the Christian faith long before I came to a pro-life position, and I thought it was completely compatible to say that you can be a Christian and be generally pro-choice. It was really thinking through these arguments, seeing the reality at university of fetal development and of abortion, seeing the impact on women, and thinking through these secular philosophical arguments. I mentioned earlier one of my really good friends became convinced of the pro-life position. He's an atheist because he read Peter Singer. We were doing a lot of this debate ourselves at university at the same time, and we were reading these secular philosophers and ethicists to see what they said. And he read Peter Singer, and Peter Singer says, unborn children and born children are not really morally different. If you can end the life of one, you can end the life of the other, and therefore infanticide is okay. And my atheist friend was like, the logic is impeccable, but the conclusion is completely wrong. And so he became pro-life. And so I was in this journey with other people, but it was really a matter of looking at those arguments in detail and coming to a sincere conviction that this is where they pointed. So yeah, I know there will always be people listening in who just don't believe me. They just think you're Christian. That's fine. Believe what you want.
And actually, the painting it as a religious issue, if you read Bernard Nathanson's memoir, Aborting America, he and Larry later said that they needed an enemy so that they could say, okay, we want to free women and make abortion safe and legal. So they need the enemy that they're fighting against, and they picked the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church is very large and was opposed to abortion. So they just created this shorthand that opposition to abortion equals a Catholic theocracy. And I mean, that shorthand even persists. If you watch TV shows and movies, whenever there's a context where abortion might come up, the person announces that they're Catholic. And it's like, oh yeah, so they're against abortion. And it's like, you can be an atheist, you can be a Methodist, you can be a Baptist, you can be Muslim, you can be Hare Krishna, you can be agnostic. The idea that you protect vulnerable human beings is not a uniquely Christian one.
For me, really, it was a matter of looking at those arguments and coming to that position.
And I know this is an extreme question and one that you're asked all the time. So what happens if a woman has been raped? She's now carrying the rapist's child. She doesn't want the rapist to have this child, understandably so. What do you say to someone like that?
I think the first thing to say is nothing. I think the first thing to do is listen and hear what the situation is, and listen to the voices of women who have been in that situation. I think we're in a danger of speaking too quickly, especially as someone who's a man. I obviously think that men should be allowed to speak about this topic, in part because they have responsibility for it. But at the same time, I have to realise my limitations. I will never be in the position of being raped and becoming pregnant as a result. And so I have to come at this with a significant amount of humility and really try my very best to empathise about that situation. The first thing I would say is that we have to listen to the voices of women who have been in this situation, because I think we're in danger of making many assumptions about them.
It's a good point. I'll interrupt you briefly there to say that we know someone who was raped and who had the child, and for her that was massively radicalizing in favor of the pro-life position. So she says it's not the baby's fault. Whatever happened, and it was not good, but it's not the baby's fault, and I've brought up my child to be the way that I've brought him up to be, not to be his biological father.
Right.
So you're right. The assumption, I think, always is, well, if a woman's been raped and then had the child, then she's obviously not happy. Well, she's not going to be happy, but we make the assumption that women in that position are all pro-abortion, which is just not my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the statistics we have show that about half of women who have been raped and become pregnant keep the baby. And there was a study done of those women, and not a single one said that they regret it. And even of the women considering abortion, when you take women who kept the baby and who had the abortion, only a tiny proportion of them said, the thing I'm most worried about is that it will remind me of the trauma. It was a very small minority. That's what we think. We always think, how can you encourage a woman to have a baby that will remind her of the trauma? Women who have been in that situation, only a small minority of them say, this is what worries me. What worries them most is the stigma of having a child out of wedlock, or these other societal factors that are nothing to do with the effect of the baby.
Yeah, a lot of women have said that people would not believe they had been raped if they didn't abort. And they felt that they were expected to abort in order to prove that the rape had happened.
So what I would say is absolutely we have to listen to women, hear what they say, hear women who have been through that situation and kept the baby. None of them say that they regret it. Hear women who have been through that situation and had an abortion, many of whom do say they regret it. But I think there are two kind of key things to think through here. The first is the life of the child. We all think that children should have their right to life protected no matter how they were conceived. So once a child has been born, no one would ever think of saying, if the woman feels that the child, now that it's been born, is a reminder of the trauma that she's been through, she should be allowed to end the life of the child. No one would say that that should be allowed. So we all think that in theory, if there is a human being with full moral status, with human rights, their life should be protected no matter how they were conceived. And so the fundamental question is, in a sense, is this a human being, a child with those human rights? But the second question that I've really thought through as a doctor is, will abortion help in the situation? Will it help heal the trauma? Again, it comes back to this point where I said, abortion is seen as the great reliever. It relieves a crisis situation, and it seems to sort of just get rid of an urgent, immediate problem which a woman feels. And that's completely understandable, and that's why so many women feel relief after having an abortion. But in the long run, does it actually help? Will it get rid of that horrific, horrendous trauma that she's been through? I don't think there's any psychologist in the world who will say, yes, it will get rid of that. The trauma will still be there, and she will be going through that regardless of whether she has an abortion or not. On the other hand, is there a potential that the baby could actually help? Now, you say in the case of your friend, that actually made her far more pro-life. And some of the limited opinion polling we have shows that women who have been the victim of unwanted sexual abuse are more pro-life than women who are not. When you read the testimonies, and there's a great book on this, it's called Victims and Victors. It's just a whole kind of catalogue of testimonies of women who have been in this situation, giving them their own voice, so you don't have to listen to a man talk about this. What they say is, this was the only thing that gave me meaning and helped me to make sense of the trauma and suffering that I had been through, and that abortion would rob me of that. This isn't just one woman who says this. This is a recurring theme time and time again. And what we know is that in trauma, one of the most important things for healing is finding meaning in that trauma. And the evidence we have seems to suggest that abortion is worse for a woman's mental health and subjects her to further trauma, whereas having the baby, and this isn't to trivialize it, because I think it's far braver than anything I would ever do, or even be in a position to do. I'm not trivializing it in any way. But those women who do have that courage and go through that, what they eventually find is that it is one of the most profound ways they could have to try and find some meaning in that trauma and to heal from that trauma. So, as I say, there's so much that could be said about this, especially from voices that are female and that really have been in that situation. So I don't want to pretend that this is just a simple issue that I've, conclusively summed up. But I do...
Another factor, and I've discussed this in other videos, is to talk about the rapist baby, to me, totally dehumanizes the woman. It treats her as if she's nothing but the soil in which a man plants her seed. When the baby is more the woman's child than it is the man's child. The X chromosome has far more genes on it than the Y chromosome. So, that rapist is going to give either an X or a Y chromosome. If he gives an X chromosome, equal genetic. If he's giving a Y chromosome, little tiny bit there. All the mitochondrial DNA comes from the mother. There are things that pass through the placenta. She is more than half, biologically, the parent of that baby. And the idea that just because this man assaulted her, that robs her of that reality, that she is far more, that she is more that child's parent than that assailant is. And then she's part of that child's life, that I don't like the idea we rob her of her humanity by saying it's the rapist's baby. That's her baby. She doesn't lose her ability to be a mother just because the guy who impregnated her was a rat bastard who did it violently. Don't dehumanize women by treating them as nothing but soil in which men plant their seed.
I want to encourage people to read more about that. Go to my website where there's more information about that, and listen primarily to those women who have been in that situation, because I think they have the most powerful voices.
Dr.
Okay, we're 20 minutes into it, but the next section is completely different. So we're going to stop this and we'll close with a final segment.